Now we're honored to have our colleague from the United Kingdom, Nigel Farage. Nigel, you one of the things when I first met you, it was amazing that you've got an interest in World War I, as I do, but man, you're one of the I think one of the best experts on the war and its implication.
Yes, I mean, Steve, for the last 30 years, I've been traveling the Western Front in France. I've even, taken coach parties and lectured over there. I see it as being a pivot, really, between the old world and the new world. It was the First World War that led to the Soviet communist experiment. It saw massive changes, things like the Ottoman Empire disappearing. But what is also fascinating to me about that war, from a British perspective, is we'd always relied on naval power. Ever since the Battle of Trafalgar, Britain ruled the waves. Britannia ruled the waves, as we sing in our patriotic songs. And we'd always relied on a very small professional army, and we were never afraid to hire mercenaries from anywhere else in the world to fight our battles. But World War I was the first time that ordinary people volunteered in their millions to go and fight in the British Army, my grandfather from my father's side being one of them. So it's the fact that here we have a war that involves all of the citizens, and I guess that's what makes it fascinating. And it was a hell of a conflict. I mean, we lost, Britain and her empire, we had about 1 million killed in action. But on top of that, nearly 2 million very seriously wounded, and by that I mean blinded, loss of limbs, that kind of thing. So the sheer level of cost was absolutely huge.
How did this is
said?
But let me ask you, how do you? The war was so horrific, and they used gas, chemical weapons. It was the wounded turned out to be worse than had worse in front of them than the dead. But how did that Victorian society, in the great houses, the great aristocrats, right, the great empires of Europe, how did they unleash such complete and total barbarity coming out of the Victorian era?
Well, that is the extraordinary thing, isn't it? I mean, Germany, whichever way you look at Germany, and okay, we can look at World War I and World War II and think bad things, but actually, in terms of art, literature, culture, Germany was one of the foremost, best educated, electorates in the whole of the world. And yet, as you say, we were reduced to total and utter barbarity. I think in many ways there is often a very fine line between a society that functions well and gets on with its neighbours, and one that disintegrates and falls to pieces. The one thing I will say about the values that people had 100 years ago is that I think in many ways they were better people than we are today. I think they had values. They had quite a strong fundamental Christian belief that went right throughout society. They believed in country. They believed in family. And they weren't, they weren't afraid. They were prepared to make sacrifices to defend the nation and to defend their people. And I'm not quite sure, 100 years on, that we're quite the same society, sadly.
How are we to get that back? If we want that back, if we want to have those ideals and have those values reinfused in culture and society, how do we do that? How do we what we lost in 20? I was saying this before you came on, is that the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, right when the guns went silent, they thought that was the end of the war to end all wars. What it was the end of the opening act of the most barbaric century in mankind's history. The worst was yet to come. There was another, of the 60 million they lost in World War I, we lost 250 million in the entire century, or wars, conflicts, famine, etc. How do you get those values back, Nigel?
Yeah, well, just quickly, Steve, let me say this. That they thought it was the war to end all wars, the 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month. But one man realized that it wasn't the war to end all wars, and his name was General Jack Pershing. He was in charge of the American contingent on the Western Front and was a very successful general. And Raheem mentioned earlier, I go all around America and I find people who know everything about the Revolution, 1812, Iwo Jima, Vietnam. They know all about this, and Americans know hardly anything about World War I. Jack Pershing, in his diary on the 11th of November, today, 99 years ago, Jack Pershing wrote in his diary, "I fear we're making a terrible mistake. We shouldn't allow an armistice. We should fight the Germans until they surrender unconditionally." He said, "I fear we'll all be back here in 20 years." And boy, wasn't he right. So all Americans, when you come to Europe, yeah, I know you visit Big Ben and you go over and visit Omaha Beach and all of that, but there's a whole load of places in the middle of France, places like Belleau Wood, where the U.S. Marine Corps fought the most amazing, historic, successful but costly battle. So I just say to Americans, go and see these places, go and understand what your country did in 1918, because without America, Germany would have won. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. Steve, I think, in answer to your question, that 2016 marks the beginning of something quite remarkable. 2016 is the year that the nation state made a comeback. It was the year that people said, you know what, we're not prepared to live with globalism, with liberalism, with being embarrassed about our culture, our heritage, who we are as a people. You know, Brexit, Trump, and you're seeing that same wave now going through Europe with elections in Austria, elections in the Czech Republic. There is definitely, without any shadow of a doubt, there is a reawakening in the concept of nation. And if you believe in a nation, then you believe in belonging to something. So I do think we're headed back in the right direction, but I'll be honest, there's a long way to go.
Nigel, I just want to jump in here because you have shown me around some of the battlefields as well. I think we should start up, by the way, Nigel's tour, Battlefield Tours company. It would be incredibly successful.
No, we love to promote that.
He's so good at that. But I just want to ask this. It's
very important people go see that.
I just want to ask this question of you, Nigel. You know, when you go around the United States, as you said, people aren't that well aware of how much the American contribution to World War I was, but there is a resurgence out there of people who are proud of their country, who, as you say, believe in the nation state. Steve was in the Citadel yesterday giving this amazing speech to a room full, and they played this incredible video up there of their cadets who had given their lives in service to the country. I want to ask you, Nigel, do you think, in addition to the resurgence of the nation state, we're actually beginning to see a resurgence in interest in what happened during the First and Second World Wars?
Do you know, when I used to go and visit sites in France and Belgium 30 years ago, and I'd go in a car, 3 or 4 of us would go, and we'd take our maps, and I remember you'd arrive at a major battlefield or a major cemetery, and you'd park up the front, and there might be 2 or 3 other cars there. Now, there are coachloads of people there. And I stopped a couple of years ago at a place called Vimy Ridge, which is etched in Canadian memory. It was the great Canadian victory of World War I in 1917. And I was there with you, Raheem, if you remember.
I do.
And we stopped at Vimy Ridge. I stopped at Vimy Ridge, and again, I'd been there in 86, I think I'd been there, and there were sort of, a few dozen people there. And I said to the lady working for the Canadian government that was in charge of it, I said, tell me, how many people now come and visit the Vimy Ridge? And she said, well, Mr. Farage, last year, 750,000.
Wow.
So actually, I mean, Brits are now going in literally unprecedented numbers every single day to go and visit these places, to go and try and understand what they mean. And it is happening, but it's not happening with America. So here's an idea, right? The next time Steve Bannon is this side of the pond, I'm going to take him to Belleau Wood and some of these places, and we'll do some footage.
Absolutely, let's do it. Actually, when I sold my bank I sold my investment bank to SocGen. Actually, when I was actually living in Paris for a while, going between Paris and London, I used to go out to the battlefield. You can only understand, France gets criticized a lot by people in America about its behavior in World War II, and you can only understand it when you go to Verdun and you go to see how the French army was absolutely just eviscerated. In fact, one of my favorite films is Paths of Glory, which I think is one of the greatest war films ever, starring Kirk Douglas. If you haven't seen it, get Paths of Glory. It is about the French army in World War I, and it's about the trenches. He's an officer in the trenches. It's about a charge that failed in the court martial afterwards. I got to tell you, it is one of the most stunning, and shot in black and white. Stanley Kubrick's, I think it's his first film. Absolutely stunning. It's a masterpiece. When you're finished watching that film, Nigel, you can't even talk. It's so powerful at the end.
Well, I tell you what, if you don't raise a tear in your eye somewhere watching Kirk Douglas in Paths of Glory, there isn't much humanity in you. And you're quite right. You know, France is criticised because she fell in 18 days in 1940. But literally, France gave everything she had and more in the 4.5 years of the First World War. Absolutely. And not just devastating losses to soldiers, but, of course, vast parts of the French countryside literally laid waste. And the Germans, when they retreated, blowing up churches, setting fire to libraries. I mean, everyone says, oh, well, of course, all the barbarity, that was purely about Nazism. No, it wasn't. There was something actually there from within German imperialism that was deeply unpleasant, and it had to be fought, and it had to be beaten. And here's the significance of America, is that by the time American troops get to the Western Front in serious numbers, by then, France has virtually ceased to be a powerful, effective army. So great have their losses been. And that's why the timing of what America did is so crucial.
Nigel Farage calling in from the United Kingdom. Nigel, thank you so much. Enjoyed this so much. Look forward to talking to you. Nigel Farage, formerly head of the UKIP.